My name is Tom Dalton, and I've written a book on Frederick Douglass's years in Lynn. Lynn is often forgotten. There are people who write about Douglass and never mention Lynn. And I wrote about Lynn because it's so important in his life. He started his career there as an abolitionist. He wrote his autobiography there, which is one of the great pieces of nonfiction in American history. Douglass was born in 1818 on a plantation in Maryland. He escaped from slavery at the age of 20. He comes to Lynn in 1841. He's in Lynn for 6 years. When he leaves Lynn, he goes to Rochester, New York. He starts a newspaper, the North Star. Frederick Douglass came to Lynn when he was 23 years old, which is remarkable. He had a wife at that point. He had 2 children. She was pregnant with a 3rd child. And when he gets to Lynn, within a few weeks, no one knows him. Within a few weeks, he's a story in the newspaper. He accepted this job to be a lecturer for the State Anti-Slavery Society, going around and talking about his years as a slave. And when he wrote his book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass in Lynn, he wrote it because he was speaking. He probably gave 1,000 speeches while he was in Lynn. And he wrote this book because people didn't believe he'd ever been a slave, because in his speeches, he's quoting from Shakespeare and the Bible, and he was totally self-taught. He was punished for trying to learn, but he learned on his own. Douglass always lived near the downtown, which is the same as saying he lived near the Quaker Meeting House. It was sort of a Quaker enclave in the downtown of Lynn, where a lot of Quakers lived and abolitionists lived, and it was sort of a safe zone. And when he wrote that book, it was so powerful that he was encouraged to flee from the country, and he went to Great Britain for 19 months, really to hide so slave catchers wouldn't come and catch him. And in Great Britain, some Quaker women raised money to buy his freedom. So it was during those Lynn years he became a free man. And he came back on April 20th, 1847, and 6 days later, which is unbelievable, he buys his house on Newhall Street for $2,200. It was a little house by the railroad tracks. And today it's the entrance to the MBTA garage off Market Street. In 1847, when the point at which he wrote a letter to a paper in England, and he said, "I'm going to stay in Lynn, it looks like, and I bought a house here, and my wife likes it here, and my children are treated well here in the schools." And so he liked Lynn, and they liked Lynn, but he was just so compelled to do this newspaper, he left and started that newspaper in Rochester, New York. That Douglass in time became the most famous Black person in the world. That all happened in Lynn. So his career begins in Lynn. He becomes a famous orator in Lynn, a famous writer in Lynn. His life is just an amazing story, and it's an amazing story of courage. And Lynn was the launching pad for Douglass.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Darrell Murkison. I am currently the executive director of the Community Minority Cultural Center here in Lynn. Frederick Douglass was known as an abolitionist. I think in the current terms, he would be seen as a person that fought for social justice. A tremendous orator that went around the country and even traveled abroad to speak about the injustices that were being perpetrated upon African Americans at that time. Not really Americans, because they did not have citizenship at that time, but African people. So he was always an advocate for righteousness and fairness and inclusion and just the humane treatment and the God-given rights to all people, but in particular those that were Africans that were being mistreated. So he was a freedom fighter without question. Frederick Douglass, he was a figure that was more renowned than people give him credit for. And it's not readily taught in the schools how important Frederick Douglass was. Like I said, Frederick Douglass traveled the country. particular down in Nantucket and New Bedford and Rochester, New York. He went all over the country, went to Washington, D.C., as far west the country had expanded at that time. He was doing all sorts of things. And like I said, even went to England and also Ireland. He found that the Irish people and the African people here in America had somewhat of a kinship where they were being mistreated as well. The legacy, from my perspective, of Frederick Douglass would be that he's a champion of people, and particularly a champion of Black people, African people that have been disenfranchised, mistreated, murdered, enslaved, all these times, for all of these years. And for Frederick Douglass, what I'd like to put into perspective for people is really think about this. And I think about this often, for not just Frederick Douglass, but many other freedom fighters. To imagine walking in their shoes at that time, it's easy for us, or easier for us, to be resistant and be vocal about things that have gone on and how we've been mistreated. But for them to do that back in the 1800s, when they did not have the law on their side, it boggles the mind. And where we think that today that is a prevailing attitude that people of color are thought less of, you can imagine how it was back in 1820, 1830, 1840, 18 anything. When that, not only was that the prevailing attitudes of many, many people, but it was law. So imagine the battles and struggles they had to go through. They made a statement. It was no small thing for them to go to sleep at night and wonder if someone's going to burn their house down with their family in it, and no one do anything about it. Or someone would drag them out of their house at night and kill them and their family just for speaking up. But yet and still, he did it. And so did many others. They put their families' lives and their lives at peril every single day. They had no protection under the law, none. So for me, a legacy for Frederick Douglass would be that of a true champion of people, a freedom fighter, an abolitionist, a humanitarian, a true American, Frederick Douglass.